Shabbat Shalom, everybody. And Mazal Tov to the Foster family. We're so thrilled for you and proud of you, Kara. On my very last camp as a leader in my Reform Zionist youth movement, Netzer, I remember being overcome by emotion as, for the final time, we sang the Netzer song at Shabbat services, a song that includes the lines, Yad Hagshama Yisrael. The destination for fulfillment is Israel. Anachnu hachalotzim shel Netzer. We are the pioneers of Netzer. Solalim et haderech le'aliyah. Setting the course for Aliyah. Even after all these years, I still remember these words because, as many of you might know, growing up in my Reform Zionist youth movement was the defining experience of my childhood in Australia. I have distinct memories of being on camp and learning about how Israel's Knesset worked, of attending rallies in support of Israel in 2014 when it was under rocket fire, of participating in and helping to organize many communal events in my hometown of Sydney for Yom Yerushalayim, Yom HaZikaron, and Yom HaAtzmaut. Additionally, the flagship program of the Zionist youth movements in Australia, including Netzer, is known as Shnat, in which participants who have just finished high school take a gap year in Israel, during which they develop leadership skills to bring back to their communities and, crucially, strengthen their Zionist identity. Although I will share that I did not actually go on Shnat in the end, I do believe that Netzer was the reason I would later spend 2 transformative years of my life in Israel, one before and one during rabbinical school. I mention my experience this morning because I see it as reflective of the broader Australian community of my formative years, one that shares much in common with my new home in Canada. For starters, like Canada, Australia has a proud history of Zionism. Australia's most famous Jew, General Sir John Monash, who was the commander of the Australian Corps in France from 1917, was later named as the president of the Zionist Federation of Australia. Additionally, in 1948, it was an Australian, Herbert Everett, who chaired the ad hoc committee on Palestine, which would propose and subsequently pass the partition plan. Australia was also the first country to officially recognize the modern state of Israel in May 1949, obviously a year after the modern state was established. Fast forward 75 years, and according to a 2017 survey of the Australian Jewish community, 92% of Jewish Australians have visited Israel, and 60% 3 times or more. 92% of us, 88% feel a personal sense of responsibility to ensure that the state of Israel continues to exist, and the security of Israel was the primary concern that united Australian Jews more than any other issue. Additionally, in the latest headline of the Australian Jewish News, the community is very excited for the prospect of direct flights from Tel Aviv to Melbourne starting next year, and before you ask, the trip will be 17 absurd hours long. In moving to Canada, it has been striking to learn of these similarities between my new home and the home I grew up in when it comes to our connection to Israel. Despite being diaspora communities literally at the opposite corners of the earth and so far from Israel as the center of our Jewish world. Canada, like Australia, has much to be proud of in its Zionist identity. In just a little snapshot, it too has long been overwhelmingly Zionist in its sensibilities and sympathies. And I learned from the Ontario Jewish Archives back in 1899, established a federation of Canadian Zionist societies, after Agudat Zion was formed in Montreal the year prior, together with sister organizations in Ottawa, Toronto, Hamilton, Winnipeg, Vancouver, and in some smaller towns too. This, together with many other Zionist entities in Canada, would later come under the auspices of the Canadian Zionist Federation. Furthermore, the Berman Jewish Data Bank in 2018 found in their national study of Canadian Jews that about 8 in 10 have visited Israel, on average 5 times to date, but give us the Australians some credit for the travel distance. 79% reported feeling very emotionally or somewhat emotionally attached to the Jewish state. Today, the UJA reports that the Israeli consulate based here in Toronto is the number 3 most active in the world, and Canada is the country with the most shinshinim in the world. Look at our Ella. In other words, my 2 countries share a parallel, deep commitment to what we at Holy Blossom refer to as home and homeland. Home being the country that we live in the here and now, and therefore have a responsibility to care for and tend to, and homeland being Israel, the place of our hearts that we feel the yearning towards as a symbol of our Hagshama, fulfillment as Jews. Therefore, this Shabbat, as we find ourselves in a double parashah, Vayakel Pekudei, it might be fitting that with all that is unfolding in Israel, even as we speak, we find our hearts torn in two between our home and homeland. This is, as we have seen in just the few short stories and statistics I shared so far, that these 2 communities are rooted, deeply rooted, in our Holy Blossom value of Ahavat Yisrael, a love of Israel. This value means that we celebrate the nation and people of Israel amidst all of her and our diversity, and encourage a tangible relationship to her, whether through investments, tourism, study, volunteering, leadership, or even aliyah. Yet love, or indeed any relationship, is complicated work. We see in Vayakel Pekudei, as we continue to read of the construction of the Mishkan that Kara just chanted so beautifully about, just how intricate this effort was. As Exodus 36 outlines, just by way of a few examples, exactly how many cloths were used to make the tabernacle, 10. Of exactly how many cubits in length they were, 28. And how much in width, 4. How many golden clasps attached them, 50. What wood was used to make the planks for the construction, acacia, and how many there needed to be, such as 20 planks on the north and 20 on the south side. 20 on the north side and 20 on the south side, for those who are interested. It is with this intricacy in mind that I believe we can see in both communities the relationship between Israel and the diaspora being reconstructed in new shapes and forms. The front page of the Melbourne edition of the Australian Jewish News just yesterday was of the hundreds of thousands of Israelis marching in Tel Aviv against the proposed judicial reforms and declaring people power, fighting for democracy, as it covered the protests that have left the streets of Israel heaving for the 10th Motzei Shabbat in a row, and will tonight theoretically be for an 11th. Additionally, the Australian Jewish News published an article on May 9 regarding the historically rare call of the Jewish and Zionist communal leadership imploring the Israeli government to change course. In this public entreaty, the 2 top bodies, the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, or ECAJ, and the Zionist Federation of Australia, the ZFA, urged Netanyahu's coalition to embrace genuine dialogue over the controversial changes to legislation affecting particularly the judicial system, pluralism in the country, and the law of return. This statement, as well as others from fellow Jewish communities, made headlines in Israel, as well as these other statements. For context, this might have been unthinkable even a few years ago, with such a statement from the Australian Jewish community being so unusual that it had to be drafted after consultation with approximately a Sanhedrin, 70 people, who were affiliated with national organizations spanning religious, political, and ideological belief. In our home of Canada, the CJN, the Canadian Jewish News, coincidentally also published a piece on March 9, not May 9, as I originally said, In conjunction with J-Space Canada and the New Israel Fund, both progressive-leaning, J-Space and the NIF had commissioned a poll to gauge Canadian Jewish attitudes surrounding the current crisis facing our Israeli brothers and sisters, and found that 59% felt it was moving in the wrong direction, 20% did not know, and only 13% felt it was going the right way. In a corresponding interview, Joe Roberts, director of J-Space Canada, expressed his surprise at the results, saying that he thought there would be some 50-50s, but almost in every case, on every policy proposal by the Israeli government today, we're looking at a 6-2 majority or an 8-2 majority. Put differently, while these organizations or viewpoints may have once been considered as alternative voices in the community, they may be becoming less and less outliers under the current circumstances. Yet I believe that although we can see in both communities the relationship evolving, as with the building of the Mishkan, it is a place that, kol nadiv libo, a place we feel our whole hearts moved towards. In the same article by the Australian Jewish News, the presidents of ECAJ and the ZFA reiterated that Australian Jewry are a deeply Zionist community, with Israel at the core of their Jewish identity, and that they celebrate Israel's successes and achievements and defend her against irrational hatred. They also acknowledged that, as diaspora Jews, they may have different rights, but their comments come from a place of unconditional love and connection, and that this threat to Israeli democracy is something that affects us as Jews in the diaspora because we always value and refer to Israel as the great democracy in the Middle East. In the same article by the CJN, it was found that at least 75% of Canadian Jews are either very or somewhat attached to Israel. The CJN further has a campaign in celebration of Israel's upcoming 75th birthday, collecting stories and photos from the first time the sender had a connection with Israel. A first family trip, a visit to a kibbutz, or even the first time that someone heard about Israel, as it and we feel the nostalgia for these memories. Finally, the most recent Israel update from our friends at Artsa Canada, the Reform Zionist organization here, reminds us that while our concerns over Israel's turmoil are real and valid, we can take a step back to, like your Australian counterparts said, celebrate her successes and achievements and the miracle of a homeland that we dreamed of for 2,000 years. We can celebrate this coming Yom HaAtzmaut, that the only sovereign Jewish country in 2 millennia has gathered its people from all corners of the earth and somehow, against all odds, become an economic, military, and cultural powerhouse based on values of justice, equality, and freedom. Since we at Holy Blossom were honored to host Anna Kislansky, CEO of the Israel Movement for Progressive Judaism, the IMPJ, last night for Kabbalat Shabbat, I would also be remiss if I did not mention how she taught us that we can equally be so proud of our reform movement in Israel, which has, in just the last decade, almost doubled its presence from 23 to 54 congregations. Yeah. This may move us to ask this morning, what can we as diaspora Jews do as we find ourselves at this junction in our hearts, split between home and homeland? Fortunately for us, our parasha offers one insight that allows us to root ourselves in Torah. Back to this phrase, kol nadiv lev or kol nadiv libo, those whose hearts were moved to contribute to the Mishkan, we too can be moved to bring gifts of both time and treasure in translation to our own Zionist efforts today. In terms of treasure, of course, first and foremost, we can donate to the IMPJ Emergency Fund, the link of which can be found on both the Holy Blossom and Artsa websites after Shabbat. We can not cancel our trips. For example, we are so thrilled that our teens have spent the week in Israel, they return tomorrow, and by all accounts have had an incredible time. We are also thrilled that many of you will be going on the UJA trip at the end of April or partaking in the Hartman Community Leadership Program in Jerusalem in June. And with Pesach fast approaching, perhaps many of you have your own separate trips planned to visit family or friends in Israel in all her spring glory. We can remain educated and be educated. Look at our Lean Into Israel page at the very top of our Holy Blossom website, which features, again after Shabbat, which features videos and writings and articles from members of our congregation involved in Israel work across the full range of outlooks and viewpoints. Ms. Kislansky also mentioned that the IMPJ is coming out with a packet of resources right in time for Shabbat Tekuma, the special Shabbat between Yom HaShoah and Yom HaZikaron or Yom HaAtzmaut, in which we look from the darkness of the Shoah to the light of the establishment of the modern state. We're also fortunate to have some very special people specifically sent to bring a piece of Israel to us. So, in short, go talk to our incredible Shinshinit Ella. Finally, we can show up. Ms. Kislansky mentioned that she has been asked to speak at a rally for Israeli democracy at Nathan Phillips Square tomorrow at 4 p.m. If you are able to go, or if this sounds interesting to you, you can take the time to go and be present to show up for Anna, which by extension is showing up for our Israeli Reform brothers and sisters. If not tomorrow, then perhaps on May 22, the UJA's annual walk for Israel. Vayakal Pekudei concludes by describing the Anan, the cloud of God's glorious presence which would fill the Mishkan once Moses had completed his work, and signaled to the Israelites that they should proceed with their journey once it had lifted, or that they should stay put if it had not dissipated. As in any relationship, when it comes to Israel and the diaspora, we may find ourselves in a time of cloud. The path forward may be uncertain, and we might only see grey skies ahead. However, if our common histories and values and the wisdom of our tradition teach us anything, we may come to understand that we have always held on to the hope that the cloud will lift once more. As we finish a book of Torah this Shabbat, there could be no more poignant way to conclude than to say and to pray, Chazak, chazak, v'nitchazek. Be strong, and be strengthened. For the sake of the teenage girl who grew up singing of a love for Israel, for the sake of our communities near and far, and for the sake of our common Ahavat Yisrael, that sacred journey upon which we must all continue venturing as we play our part in its sacred construction. Ken Yehi Ratzon and Shabbat Shalom.